Whilst the diggers were slogging through the jungle or sweating it out at Nui Dat or Vung Tau, another group of Aussie servicemen and American were working tirelessly just over the horizon and out of the headlines. These were the forgotten men of the Vietnam War, the Navy. More than 13,000 Aussies went to war at sea during the Vietnam War. Far from the jungle, but never out of danger. This is their story. The sailors who served on what was known as the Gunline. During the Vietnam War, the Royal Australian Navy played a vital support and combat role alongside US and South Vietnamese forces. Its main jobs included providing naval gunfire support, intercepting enemy vessels, mine clearance, transporting troops and supplies, and conducting helicopter-based air operations. In addition, Australian ships also joined coastal patrols, convoy escorts, rescued downed pilots, and even provided critical medical and diving support. This made the Navy one of the most versatile parts of Australia's effort in Vietnam. We'll explore each of these missions and see them through the perspective and eyes of an Australian sailor and Vietnam Navy veteran who was there, my uncle. So for once, you'll be hearing from a real Aussie and not a pom prattling on in a man cave. As we explore the role of the Australian Navy in this war, my Uncle Ray will chip in with relevant points or memories. Unlike the Australian Army of the Vietnam War era, the Navy did not contain national servicemen. They were all volunteers. Blokes would volunteer for a variety of reasons.
After leaving school, I studied accountancy and commercial law and quickly discovered I didn't really like it. And I worked in an office doing general duties. And I said to my father one day, I don't like this, what can I do? He said, why don't you join the Navy? You were in the Sea Cadets in Portland, it was early high school years. And I said, yeah, good. So I went straight out, got all the paperwork, brought it home, filled it in, said to my parents, okay, sign me up. And within a couple of weeks I was sent up to Adelaide, did all the entrance exams. I was given a date to join the Navy, which happened to be on my mother's birthday, the 6th of January. So off I went.
Young recruits would go to HMAS Cerberus, located in Victoria, which served as a primary basic training base for the Navy. There, they would be moulded into sailors. Young Australians joining the Royal Australian Navy in the 1960s underwent rigorous training that combined discipline, seamanship, and technical skills.
I was 17 years and 8 months old when I joined. I was sent to Cerberus, a big naval establishment in Victoria, just south of Melbourne. The training was pretty intense. I suppose like everything, you get woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning to pack up and go for a run just to test you out, all that sort of stuff. But I enjoyed all the training, except for we were kept on base for about the first 4 or 6 weeks, including the weekends, probably just to indoctrinate us. Another thing I remember is I had a nice haircut before I joined the Navy, short back and sides, but that wasn't good enough. Everybody got a number 1 cut. We're all even, yes.
In basic training, the recruits would learn about naval procedures, basic weapons handling, drill, firefighting, damage control, and were taught about life at sea. The training emphasised teamwork, obedience, and endurance. After completing basic training, recruits would move on to learn specialised skills. The specialist courses would cover engineering, gunnery, signals, electrics, or aviation support. The sailors would learn to operate and maintain ships' weapons, radar, and communication systems under realistic conditions. In theory, recruits would then be allowed to select what branch or trade that they would wish to serve in. However, any of you that have served in the Navy know that this is not always the case.
After we'd been in for a while, we were interviewed, and I actually wanted to be in the communications branch, but I was convinced that no, eventually pay rises were going to come in for skill sets, and electricians were going to get the most money, and all my results said, you should be an electrician anyway. So I succumbed and became an electrician.
I guess this was 1963, 64?
64.
Physical fitness and mental resilience were emphasised throughout the whole process, ensuring that by the time sailors left their training, they were ready to serve effectively aboard warships in both peacetime duties and high-risk combat operations, like those encountered in Vietnam. In the early to mid-1960s, few Australian servicemen had any awareness about the unfolding conflict in Vietnam.
I wasn't greatly aware of it anyway.
So when you were going through the whole training, there was no mention of that at all?
No.
At the time, the only significant Australian presence in Vietnam was the roughly 30-man Australian Training Team Vietnam. From 1965, US pressure would compel the Australian government to increase both their contribution and commitment to the conflict. This included the Navy. So let's look at the 5 main missions of the Australian Navy in Vietnam. Number 1. Naval Gunfire Support. The Royal Australian Navy's biggest continuous combat contribution to the Vietnam War was the provision of one destroyer on permanent rotation with the US Navy's 7th Fleet. This ship operated either on the Gunline off South Vietnam or off the coast of North Vietnam in what was known as Operation Sea Dragon, delivering naval gunfire support, intercepting hostile craft and conducting coastal bombardment and interdiction against enemy targets. Between 1967 and 1972, Aussie ships rotated through Operation Sea Dragon and gunline duties off the coast of Vietnam. HMAS Perth and Hobart would conduct 3 tours of duty each. Brisbane would do 2 and Vendetta 1. Kicking his heels on a shore base, Ray volunteered for Vietnam service.
I was sent to a shore establishment, a communications base in Sydney, Potts Point, and I wanted to get war service, so I've actually volunteered to go and join the Perth, and 2 or 3 days later I was on my way for 6 months up in Vietnam waters, on the gunline, etc.
The destroyer's tours of duty were long, relentless and arduous, lasting many months. And how long was your rotation there, I guess?
Oh, up there, about 6 months.
6 months?
Yeah, it might have been 7, yeah.
Royal Australian Navy destroyers such as HMAS Perth, Hobart, Brisbane and Vendetta provided naval gunfire support to Allied troops ashore. Operating close to the coast, they bombarded enemy positions, supply routes and fortifications in support of ground operations. Rather than a Far East booze cruise, this was dangerous work. Ships were often under threat from enemy coastal artillery, mines and aircraft, but their firepower saved countless Allied lives. Gunfire support was divided into 2 areas. Above the DMZ, Operation Sea Dragon targeted North Vietnamese supply routes and coastal defences as part of a strategic interdiction campaign, while the Gunline focused on providing close-range naval gunfire support for Allied troops fighting in South Vietnam. The role of the actual destroyer on the Gunline, what was the role of the ship from the first?
It was multi-purpose. Vietnam spread into 4 military regions. Number 4 is down near Cambodia, so we operated in all those regions. Anything above the DMZ was Sea Dragon, and we operated up there as well as required with the big super carriers, rescue destroyer.
During one tour, Ray was aboard HMAS Perth on the Gunline, where Aussie sailors demonstrated their skill and determination. In Vietnam, it was often American firepower backing up Australian troops on the ground. However, on this occasion, the roles were reversed. When a US patrol boat base came under attack, it was the Perth answering calls for help, using our naval artillery to beat back an attack by the Viet Cong.
An American patrol boat based down in Fort Imar was under attack from a lot of the Viet Cong, and we fired over 300 shells just there alone. And a couple of days later, 3 young Vietnamese blokes came out in a tinny and surrendered to us. We then had to return to Subic Bay very post-haste to get new gun barrels because the others were bucketed.
During the entire tour, Perth would fire a tremendous amount of shells in support of Allied operations.
We fired over 13,000 5-inch shells. So yes, we were busy. The ship was shaking all the time.
Speaking of another occasion on the gun line,
I think we probably fired something like 205, 210 shells in that period. And the barrels were so hot they cooked an egg on one.
off the North Vietnamese coast on Operation Sea Dragon, the destroyers would target enemy radar stations, boat repair facilities, bridges and SAM sites, even on occasions reportedly providing fire support to special forces operating in the DMZ area. When US or Australian ships crossed the DMZ into the Gulf of Tonkin, their crews immediately heightened combat readiness and went on high alert.
When you went above the demilitarised zone, when you were on Perth, was that a very different atmosphere of operating?
Yes, because of the pace. You know, these super carriers, huge things, roaring around the ocean, flinging planes off everywhere. And yeah, at the end of 12-hour shift, you knew you'd been working, sort of thing. Even if there's nothing specific, the ship is working, so you're working, yeah.
Among the many threats they faced was the notorious Tiger Island, a small outlying island bristling with enemy coastal guns and missile sites, capable of striking ships operating close to shore. The Aussie Navy would come under fire on numerous occasions. In October 1967, during HMAS Perth's first deployment, she was hit by North Vietnamese shore batteries. One shell detonated, injuring 7 sailors, causing a fire and extensive damage. To show you the intense nature of the fighting, Hobart, in less than 2 weeks in April 1967, fired over 1,600 rounds supporting US Marines. The destroyer was fired on by shore batteries several times, and on one occasion took minor shrapnel damage. Later, the Hobart would assist the USS Forrestal treating casualties after a major fire on the US aircraft carrier killed 134 sailors and wounded over 160. During that deployment, Hobart would fire over 10,000 shells and be fired on 10 times. Hobart was awarded the United States Navy Unit Commendation for this tour of duty. Individual awards to the crew included a Distinguished Service Order, a British Empire Medal, a mention in dispatches, and 25 Naval Board commendations. HMAS Perth would also receive United States Navy Unit Commendation and Meritorious Unit Commendation pennants. These were awarded for her first and second deployments. Highlighting the dangers of maritime operations, tragically, in a later tour, Hobart was involved in a friendly fire incident on the 17th of June 1968, when a US Air Force F-4 Phantom jet mistakenly attacked the ship with missiles. The attack killed 2 Australian sailors and injured 7 others, but the ship survived with significant damage to its radar, weapon systems and hull. Destroyers would alternate between gunline duty, Operation Sea Dragon and other tasks, such as rescuing down pilots, where 2 destroyers would be deployed forward on either North SAR or South SAR station, SAR standing for Search and Rescue. The dedicated work of these destroyers would save many American airmen from death or captivity.
Did you have to collect any downed pilots or anything as well? Was that part of the role?
Was, because we were the rescue destroyer, but luckily all the pilots behaved for us, so we didn't have to. Although later in my career on the Brisbane, we were operating in the up near the Arctic Circle with the British and all that, and we had to pick up, I think it was one of our choppers, out delivering mail.
planes, launched either from carriers or air bases on land, would act as artillery observation and spotters for the destroyers during fire support operations.
On the gunline, was anyone stationed, anyone from the ship, like artillery observers, forward artillery observers, anyone on land at all?
No. It was all Americans.
All Americans?
Yeah. They were either in the little spotter planes or sitting in a tree calling in support and all that sort of stuff. Any voice I ever heard up in the CIC was always American.
Aussie and US destroyers would also get carrier escort duties in the vicinity of Yankee Station. But heaven help you if you fell overboard.
When you're operating with one of these carriers, it actually goes faster than your ship. You know, you flat out 38, 39 knots, and you're 12 hours on, 12 hours off. You're wearing a life jacket the whole time you're operational, and you're told, if you fall over, stay safe, and a helicopter hopefully can come and pick you up later, because the ship is not going to stop for an operation.
Ultimately, during these missions, over the course of the war, at least 29 ships would be damaged by enemy fire, many having to go to Japan or the Philippines for repair work. Here's just a snapshot of some of the main attacks on Allied warships during the period. Operating off Yankee Station in the DMZ coast of North Vietnam was particularly dangerous. In April 1972, USS Higbee was bombed by North Vietnamese MiG-17s, destroying a 5-inch gun mount and wounding 4 crew. The same month, USS Lloyd Thomas was hit by a shore battery, injuring 3 crew. In July 1972, USS Warrington triggered 2 mines, suffering severe damage. And we've already covered the Perth and Hobart. In South Vietnam, naval assets also had to be on guard for Viet Cong guerrilla activity. In May 1964, a US ship, the former escort carrier Card, was even sunk in Saigon Harbour by the Viet Cong laying explosives. In November 1968, in the Mekong Delta, the US LST Westchester was struck by limpet mines laid by Viet Cong frogmen and severely damaged, resulting in 25 crew killed. Even one Australian landing ship transporting troops and equipment, the Clive Steele, was hit in the Mekong Delta by 3 RPGs whilst in transit. Whilst they were in the operational area, Aussie destroyers were supported by US Navy replenishment ships. Overall, rations were good and the mail was pretty frequent.
The food on board was American, very sweet bread, lots of pork and chicken, not much beef, and the beer. If we weren't operational, say we went off line to refuel or whatever, the captain might give a quick beer issue, 1 can per man per night sort of thing. And as soon as you did your RAS sort of thing, you were back on the station again.
Mail? You got obviously mail fairly regularly or not?
Yeah, it wasn't too bad. Yeah, they'd send it out with the RAS ships and all that sort of stuff, or somebody would chopper it out to us. Yeah.
Do you have a helicopter on board at all?
No.
Okay.
No. DDGs don't carry helicopters, no.
During the deployment, destroyers would usually take R&R in either Hong Kong, Bangkok or Singapore. Sailors would use the time to catch up on their reading, visit a few museums or temples, and generally get a good night's sleep. Well, that's what my Uncle Ray says the Navy did. Now, anyone who knows Ray also knows that he's a bit of a charmer and can talk his way into anything. Because of this, it became a standard joke on board that he was banned from having any interaction with the Americans whilst at sea.
I was on a list of never to be transferred to a US aircraft carrier whilst at sea under any circumstances list, because I loved Phantom fighters. And the captain of the XO knew that if I went over as a swap, I would wrangle my way into one of those planes, and they were terrified that then I'd get shot down over somewhere like Laos or Cambodia, where supposedly they weren't fighting.
In total, for Operation Sea Dragon and gunline duties during the Vietnam conflict, Australia's destroyers travelled nearly 400,000 miles and fired over 100,000 rounds of ammunition, supporting military operations. Mission 2, Logistics and Transport. The former aircraft carrier, HMAS Sydney, nicknamed the Vung Tau Ferry, made regular trips transporting Australian soldiers, vehicles and supplies between Sydney and South Vietnam. Originally an aircraft carrier, Sydney was recommissioned as a fast troop transport and was tasked with intra-theatre support, moving both Australian and American vehicles and equipment. The Vung Tau Run offloaded infantry, equipment and supplies. Ray served on the Sydney and maintained electrical equipment during the journey. This included all the cranes.
I spent 2 years on the Sydney doing that run, and we did about, 12 or 13 runs in that time.
What were your watches and shift cycles like at the time?
Being an electrician, I basically worked just day shifts. Very seldom. Well, we weren't closed up because we weren't in action stations and that sort of stuff. So unlike a lot of people, like stokers and radar plotters and all that sort of stuff, my day was start at 8, finish at 4. Unless something was wrong, then I had to work till it was fixed.
On the regular trips between Australia and Vung Tau, relations between the Army and Navy on board were generally good.
They were pretty friendly. We were pretty friendly, taking them up and then bringing them back and all that sort of stuff. And we intermingled quite a bit. They were good guys, When they were coming back, a lot of them didn't want to talk about it anyway, what they'd gone through, sort of thing. So, no, but they were fine. They were good.
On arrival at Vung Tau, sailors would work hard to ensure logistics operations were carried out as quickly and smoothly as possible. They would also provide protection for the soldiers who were leaving the carrier and being transported to the port, and in addition offload vital equipment on cranes.
And we had 6 landing craft on there, so that's where I finished up working, looking after them and looking after seaplane crane and the other 2 cranes on the flight deck, getting ready. Make sure that when we got into Vung Tau, everything was working. Forklift trucks in the hangar, most important, right? So we used to look after those as well because the aircrew would drive them and wreck them. Just a couple of days before we got to Vung Tau on one of the trips, they absolutely wrecked all the wiring on one of the forklifts. We had to rewire this thing completely with no diagrams. So we just pulled one forklift up beside it and copied it as best we could. And 2 days later, when we started up, it worked.
One of Ray's other duties was transporting soldiers on landing craft to the shore.
When you were taking the landing craft out to the bay and back, was there any sort of threat?
Well, because all the troops are down in the LCM, we would have a driver and somebody with an SLR. And we used to take in turns of driving and being but thankfully didn't have to fire on anyone.
During the final stage of the journey from Australia, Sydney would be escorted into Vung Tau Harbour by a naval ship. Ray served on the Yarra for one such mission. On at least one occasion, HMAS Melbourne, a fellow aircraft carrier, would escort Sydney on the trip, but would not enter Vietnamese waters. Although Melbourne was an operational aircraft carrier, Australia would not commit her to fighter-borne operations over Vietnam. Australian forces were also supported by chartered supply ships like Japarit and Bunaroo, which kept Australian troops on land supplied and reinforced. However, the use of civilian unionised crews sometimes led to disputes and delays that disrupted operations. Sadly, this created a sense of bad blood between the military and some politicians, who service personnel believed were not supporting fully their efforts.
We had a transport ship called the Japarit, and Bob Hawke was the boss of the ACTU at the time, and he wouldn't let his workers load that ship and take up stores of munitions and ammunition and all that to Vung Tau. And then he later became the Prime Minister of Australia. And after the war, he took the salute in Sydney Town Hall for a return. Not good. There was a lot of booing. There was a lot of people turning their back on him as they marched past and all that sort of stuff.
Mission 3, Helicopter Air Support. The RAN Helicopter Flight Vietnam worked alongside the US Army's 135th Assault Helicopter Company. Flying Iroquois or Huey helicopters, these crews carried out combat missions, troop insertions, medical evacuations, and gunship missions. Their integration with US Army units made them one of the most unique and respected Australian contributions to the war. Mission 4: Coastal Patrol and Escort. Australian destroyers and frigates also joined US patrol operations like Operation Market Time, which aimed to stop the flow of supplies to sea to the Viet Cong. They searched suspect vessels, escorted troop transports, and provided naval presence and deterrence in contested waters. Finally, mission number 5: Mine clearing and medical support. Australian Navy clearance divers played a critical role in mine disposal and underwater repairs, often working in dangerous river and harbour environments. Divers would take station in Vung Tau port and check for mines and explosive devices which may have been attached to ships. They would also, after a particularly bad storm when the rivers had washed out, even have to brave snakes. Speaking of his time on HMAS Yarra,
we escorted the Sydney into Vung Tau, and that was pretty hectic. Everything was flat out. They'd had the storms, wash all the snakes and all that down the river. And Vung Tau Harbour, you could virtually walk from the ship to the shore. And we had poor divers who were sent over to do chain sweeps of the bottom. I was terrified. I thought it was the most horrific thing in the world. And please don't let me fall over the ship. They'll always be in my brain. Honestly, it was so thick, it was like you could walk over the top of them to the shore. Incredible. And these poor divers had to go in the water with them.
Without doubt, one of the smallest and unrivalled Australian units to serve in Vietnam was the Australian Clearance Diving Team 3, CDT-3, an elite group of 49 officers and sailors. They were divers trained in the dangerous business of explosive ordnance disposal and who established an enviable reputation for courage and innovation. Divers would frequently check ships' hulls for explosives and mines.
Down south, in the military regions, especially if we were just crawling along at night sort of thing and close to the coast, in case any divers came out, tried to put any mines on your ship and all that sort of stuff. So we were very aware of our safety.
In addition to providing security for Vung Tau Port, divers were involved in regular searches of Australian Army water transport craft and other ships. This task was known as Operation Stable Door and was intended to protect and secure South Vietnamese ports and shipping from sabotage by the Viet Cong. In the course of their duties, Australian clearance divers conducted about 7,500 ship searches. Australian medical personnel also served aboard Allied hospital ships and coastal bases. They would treat Australian, American, South Vietnamese, civilian and enemy casualties, often under combat conditions. Like many families of the era, Ray wasn't the only son to serve in the Vietnam War.
My brother, he was in the army, he was an engineer. He was in Nui Dat. Okay. He got shot at, but they always said, if the kids aren't out playing in the morning, we don't go out to work.
Service personnel in the Navy would have received a variety of campaign service and individual awards, such as the Vietnam Medal. We've covered many of these medals in previous videos, so for the sake of time, I won't go into them in this one. Over the course of the war, 8 Royal Australian Navy officers and sailors were killed, and nearly 50 were wounded or injured in the course of their duties. The Navy finally withdrew from Vietnam in March 1972. Furthermore, to highlight the dangers of naval operations during this period, the aircraft carrier HMAS Melbourne was involved in 2 collisions. In 1964, she collided with HMAS Voyager, splitting Voyager in 2 and resulting in the deaths of over 80 sailors. In 1969, whilst on exercise in the South China Sea, Melbourne collided with the US destroyer Frankie Evans, resulting in the deaths of over 70 US sailors. I'd like to sincerely thank Ray for agreeing to this interview. He's a modest, unassuming man who rarely talks about himself. So I really appreciate his willingness on this occasion to share his story. We both hope that this video in its own modest way sheds some light on Australians like him in the Navy who served during the Vietnam War and whose service is generally overlooked or forgotten. Ray was actually the inspiration that got me diving down this rabbit hole of the Australian military in Vietnam. When many years ago one day I saw his medals, and asking what they were as I didn't recognise a strange one, he said casually, "Oh, that's my Vietnam medal." Until then, like most Brits, I had no idea Australia were even in the war, and even then I assumed it was just a token effort until I started looking into it and was fascinated by the whole story. Now clearly in retirement, Ray enjoys nothing more than spending time with his family, watching the AFL and cricket, and enjoying the odd glass of red. In recent years, he's visited Vietnam, paying his respects at battlefields such as Long Tan, and being touched by the warmth and generosity of the Vietnamese people that he encountered. I hope you found some value from this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.